My sister called me a failure at a family reunion, but didn't know who I really am. The invitation came in the mail a month ago, an elegant cream-colored envelope with gold trim, the kind that screamed wealth and formality. My mother was hosting one of her grand reunions at her massive estate. I hadn't been to one in years. Work kept me busy, and if I were being honest, I never saw much point in going. These gatherings were less about reconnecting and more about subtle and not so subtle competitions. Who had the best job, the biggest house, the most expensive car? I'm 32, and while my family never took me seriously, I've done pretty well for myself. I run a cybersecurity consulting firm specializing in data protection for mid-size companies. It started as a small operation after I left my corporate job, but it grew quickly once we secured a few big contracts. But no one in my family knows that. They assume I barely scrape by, probably hopping from one gig to another. I never corrected them because frankly, I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't interested in their approval or the exhausting games they played. Growing up, it was always about appearances and achievements. My sister Maria followed the predictable path, law, while I chose a different route. She was the golden child, the one everyone measured themselves against. A corporate lawyer with a perfect resume, she'd always been arrogant, but it got worse over the years. When I first decided not to go the traditional route, she mocked me relentlessly. Not everyone is cut out for success, she told me once, laughing like it was just an objective fact. I never responded to her taunts. It was never worth the effort. My parents actually knew about my success. They urged me to go to the reunion, saying it was time I showed them all, but I had no interest in proving anything. Still, after a lot of nudging, I gave in. Fine. I'd go. I'd show up, sit through the usual passive-aggressive conversations, and then leave. No drama. The reunion was set at my mother's sprawling estate, a mansion with marble floors, grand chandeliers, and staff serving drinks on silver trays. I arrived in my regular car, nothing flashy. Most of my family had arrived in luxury vehicles, stepping out in tailored suits and designer dresses. A few glanced my way, offered half-hearted greetings, then moved on. No surprise there. Dinner was held in a grand dining hall, long tables set with expensive china. The conversation was exactly what I expected: promotions, investments, extravagant vacations. Maria was in her element, holding court with other family members who hung on her every word. It didn't take long before she turned her attention to me. "So," she said, swirling her wine glass, "you still struggling to pay rent, or have you finally found a real job?" A few chuckles followed. No one outright laughed, but no one stopped her either. It was how things worked in our family, mockery disguised as casual conversation. I didn't react. I never did. "I'm doing all right," I said, pouring myself some water. Maria smirked. "That's just another way of saying no. You know, I could help you out if you need connections. It's never too late to start over." I shrugged, and that only made her bolder. With a few drinks in her, she got louder. "See, this is what happens when people don't take their careers seriously. Not everyone can be successful. Some people just, well, you know." The room went quiet. Even my mother, who usually encouraged these little social battles, seemed uncomfortable. My parents exchanged glances, but they knew better than to start something. I stayed calm. I always did. Then my younger sister, probably the only one there without an agenda, turned to me. "What do you actually do?" I kept it simple. "I work in tech," I said. "I do pretty well." Maria scoffed. "That's just code for unemployed." More chuckles. A few exchanged looks, some amused, some pitying. Maria leaned back in her chair, completely smug. "Man, I hope you're at least saving up. Maybe in a few years, you'll finally be able to buy a house." I could have said a lot of things. I could have told them about the business, the investments, the multiple properties, but where was the fun in that? Instead, I smirked and said, "If you really think that, I guess we'll see." Maria laughed, thinking she'd won. I just let her. This was going to be interesting. The morning after the dinner, I woke up early and went downstairs for breakfast. My parents were already there, sitting at a large dining table filled with fresh fruit, pastries, and just about every breakfast option you could imagine. Most of the family hadn't come down yet, but I could hear voices from the next room. Maria was there, loud as ever, holding court with my father. She was bragging about her latest courtroom victory, something about a high-profile corporate case that only someone with real skill could handle. The way she talked, you'd think she had personally rewritten the entire legal system. I ate quietly while my parents exchanged glances. They didn't say anything, but I could tell they were waiting for something to happen. My father sipped his coffee, clearly enjoying the show unfolding in the next room. Then my father started talking about a tech startup he had been following. He was impressed with how fast it had grown and mentioned that it was on track for a massive expansion soon. I kept eating, not saying a word. Maria, of course, didn't miss a chance to throw in her opinion. She dismissed the entire tech industry as overhyped and said most startups were just lucky flukes that burned out in a few years. She had no idea the company my father was talking about was mine. Not long after, Maria started making her usual passive-aggressive comments. She made some remark about how some people wasted their potential chasing pointless dreams instead of securing a stable career. No names were mentioned, but it was obvious who she was talking about. A few minutes later, Maria and some other family members started organizing a golf outing. It was their usual networking thing, a chance to show off, make connections, and talk business. Maria made it clear I wasn't invited. She played it off casually, saying it was more of a professional gathering, nothing I would find interesting. I didn't care. I wasn't interested in spending a whole day listening to them stroke each other's egos, but I decided to tag along anyway just to watch the show. At the golf course, Maria was in her element, bragging about all the high-level people she knew. She dropped names, exaggerated stories, and acted like she was the most important person there. Everything was going as usual until an unexpected guest arrived. During the conversation, one of my investors, a well-known business executive, happened to be on the same course. He spotted me from a distance and gave me a nod of recognition before casually mentioning how well my company was doing in an industry discussion, catching my family's attention. He mentioned how excited he was about our upcoming expansion and hinted at some major deals in the works. Maria froze. She didn't say a word at first, just stared like she couldn't process what was happening. The rest of the group went silent too. They weren't used to seeing someone important giving me that kind of recognition. Then the questions started. My father, who had barely paid attention to me the night before, suddenly perked up. He started asking about my company, my work, what exactly I did. I kept my answers simple. I didn't brag, didn't try to prove anything, just gave them the facts. But the more I talked, the more interested they became. Maria, still trying to hold on to some sense of control, attempted to brush it off. She said startups fail all the time, that success in tech is mostly luck, and that it was nothing compared to a stable, prestigious career like hers. I let her talk. Then casually, I mentioned my company's valuation. The number was in the millions. The entire group went silent. A few people looked genuinely shocked, while others tried to hide their reactions. My father nodded slowly, clearly reevaluating everything he had assumed about me. The executive, still standing next to me, added another detail. He confirmed that my company was growing fast, had serious backing, and was projected to double in value soon. He even mentioned that other investors were eager to get in before it was too late. Maria's face turned red. She looked like she had just been punched in the gut. For the first time, she had nothing to say. My parents stayed quiet, but I caught my father smirking behind his coffee cup. My mother simply folded her hands in her lap, looking completely at peace. No one said anything for a long moment. Then, my father cleared his throat and changed the subject, but the energy had shifted. Maria wasn't the center of attention anymore, and she knew it. Later that night, the atmosphere at the family gathering had changed. Conversations that used to be about real estate investments and law firm promotions had shifted. More family members were coming up to me, asking about my company, my work, how I got started. Some were just curious. Others were clearly kicking themselves for not taking me seriously before. Maria, on the other hand, was still trying to regain control. She made offhand remarks about tech startups being unstable, how most of them crash within a few years, how real wealth comes from established industries. She threw in a few stories about failed startups she had read about, subtly trying to paint a picture that my success was temporary at best, but it wasn't working. Her usual confidence had a slight edge of frustration now. The same people who used to nod along when she talked were now more interested in what I had to say. A couple of my relatives even started asking if I had investment opportunities open. Maria tried to steer the conversation back to herself, mentioning her latest big case, but the excitement wasn't there anymore. She was still respected, but not idolized the way she used to be. Then, the moment that shifted everything happened. One of my younger relatives, who had been quiet most of the night, suddenly asked Maria how much she made a year. Maria didn't hesitate. She proudly gave the number, expecting the usual admiration. Before anyone could respond, another relative, someone who had been listening closely all evening, casually said, "That's probably what Ops company makes in a month." Silence. Maria laughed, but it was forced. A tight, uncomfortable chuckle. Her fiancé, who had been sitting beside her, shifted slightly, pressing his lips together like he wished he were anywhere else. A few people exchanged glances. Someone tried to move the conversation forward, but Maria wasn't letting it go. She leaned forward, making sure everyone heard her, as she insisted that most of my company's success must have come from investors, that I was probably just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. That was when the investor, the same executive from earlier, spoke up again. "Actually, Op built this company from the ground up. He's one of the sharpest business minds I've seen." Another silence. This time it wasn't awkward. It was realization. I could see it happening, the shift in perception. Some family members who had dismissed me before started to show a bit more interest, asking casual questions about my work. A few were still skeptical, but the dynamic had noticeably shifted. The way they looked at me had changed, as if they were finally seeing me for the first time. Maria's face was red. She barely held it together before suddenly standing up. She muttered something about needing to check emails and left the gathering without another word. Her fiancé hesitated for a second before quietly following her. As soon as they were out of sight, the whispers started. A couple of my relatives exchanged knowing looks. One of them muttered that Maria had always been like this. Another relative, someone who had once hung on to her every word, shook their head and said, "I never realized how arrogant she was." I didn't react. I didn't have to. A little later, while I was getting a drink, Maria's fiancé approached me. He looked hesitant but serious. He apologized for Maria's behavior, saying she wasn't handling things well. He admitted that she had always felt superior to me and that seeing the family's reaction tonight had shaken her more than she would ever admit. I didn't gloat. I just shrugged and told him, "It's fine. She'll figure things out eventually." That night, Maria didn't show up again, but I overheard some relatives talking in hushed voices, saying she had been venting to them. She was still trying to convince herself that my success wasn't real, that it was overhyped and not sustainable. The same excuses people make when they realize they bet on the wrong horse. The next morning, one of my relatives posted a subtle social media update about the reunion. Nothing too obvious, but the message was clear. Something about how some people should be careful who they underestimate. The comments started rolling in. Some were lighthearted, others a little sharper. But one thing was obvious: Maria wasn't the one people were admiring anymore. Maria showed up to breakfast the next morning looking exhausted. Her usual confidence was replaced with something more controlled, like she was trying to keep herself in check. She didn't acknowledge me, didn't say anything directly, but her irritation was obvious. While I sat with my parents, casually sipping my coffee, I caught sight of Maria off to the side, speaking in hushed tones with a few other relatives. It was clear she was working on damage control, probably trying to spin a new version of events. A few nods, some murmured agreements. It didn't take much to see where this was going. As the morning went on, the divide in the family became more noticeable. Some of my relatives, particularly the younger ones, were openly impressed by my success. They asked more questions, genuinely interested in my work. A couple of family members, the ones who always put Maria on a pedestal, had shifted their approach too, suddenly acting like they had always believed in me. But then there were the others, the ones who had always sided with Maria. They weren't outright hostile, but they made their opinions known. "Money does not equal respect," one of them muttered at the table. Another made a comment about how real success is about legacy, not numbers. Then Maria's fiancé got involved. He was never outright rude, but he had a way of making passive-aggressive comments sound polite. He talked about how humility is more important than wealth and how some people lose sight of what really matters. He never said my name, but he didn't have to. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Maria sat next to him, looking increasingly uncomfortable. She wasn't speaking much, mostly just picking at her food, while her fiancé kept throwing out backhanded comments. It was clear that last night had rattled her, and she was still grasping for a way to regain control. Then without warning, Maria snapped. She turned toward me, voice sharp enough to cut through the room's chatter. She accused me of hiding my success, of deliberately keeping it a secret just to make the family look foolish. She demanded to know why I never mentioned anything, why I let everyone believe I was struggling, when in reality, I was doing better than most of them. I set my cup down, let the silence stretch for a moment, then simply said, "You embarrassed yourself." A few people inhaled sharply. Maria's jaw clenched. Then one of our relatives, one of the few in the family who had never really taken sides, spoke up. He leaned back in his chair, looked Maria straight in the eye, and said, "Jealous of what? He is doing better than all of us." Maria's entire argument crumbled right there. She tried to recover, to spin it again, but the shift in the room was undeniable. Some of the same people she had been whispering to earlier were now avoiding eye contact. No one was nodding along anymore. The weight of the moment was sinking in for everyone. In a final desperate attempt, Maria scoffed and said, "Let's see where you are in 5 years." I shrugged. "I'll be fine. I have investments ensuring financial stability for decades." And then finally, her fiancé snapped. He turned to her, voice sharp with frustration, and told her to stop embarrassing herself. The entire room went silent. Maria's face darkened. She didn't argue, didn't try to defend herself. Instead, she pushed her chair back, stood up, and left the table without another word. Later that afternoon, a relative pulled me aside with an amused look. Apparently, Maria had been going around asking different family members if they really knew what my business was about. She was fishing for anything she could use against me, trying to find some angle to discredit my success. No one took the bait. If anything, they found it entertaining. Then, a few hours later, Maria made a vague post on social media. Something about how some people think money makes them better, but real success is about respect and legacy. It didn't mention me by name, but it didn't need to. The timing was obvious. The post got a few polite likes, mostly from the same relatives who had always sided with her, but no one engaged with it. A few family members even shared unrelated posts right after, effectively pushing it out of view. It was clear that most people weren't interested in entertaining her narrative anymore. As the evening rolled in, I stepped outside for some fresh air, and that was when Maria found me. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her face was tense, and her voice was low, like she was barely holding herself together. She accused me of turning the family against her, of making her look like a fool in front of everyone. I just looked at her and said, "You did that yourself." That was it. No argument. No debate. Just the truth. She stared at me for a moment, like she was waiting for me to say more. When I didn't, she turned and walked off, muttering something under her breath. Not long after, my father called a family meeting. It wasn't anything formal, just a gathering in the main living room, where most of the relatives were already sitting and chatting. The growing tension had become too obvious to ignore, and my father decided to address it directly. Maria tried to play the victim. She claimed I had humiliated her first, that I had been hiding my success just to embarrass her. She looked around the room waiting for support. She didn't get it. One of my relatives shook her head and reminded everyone that Maria had been mocking me for years. Another relative pointed out how Maria had been the one making dismissive comments about startups and acting like I was some kind of failure. A few younger family members laughed, saying it was funny how Maria could dish it out but couldn't take it. My parents tried to calm the situation. My mother insisted that Maria was being misunderstood, that she was just feeling pressured because the family was suddenly changing how they saw things, but no one was buying it. Then came the real blow. Her fiancé, who had been sitting quietly during most of this, finally spoke up. He looked exhausted, like he had been holding something back for too long. And then he said it, he needed some space. The room went completely silent. Maria stiffened. She looked at him, then at the family, then back at him. She opened her mouth to say something but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she just nodded, turned around and walked out of the room. She didn't say another word. Within an hour, Maria was gone. She packed up her things and left the reunion early, not bothering to say goodbye to anyone. A few relatives tried to act like it was no big deal, but the whispers started almost immediately. People were speculating about her engagement. Some thought the relationship wouldn't last. Others just shook their heads saying they never realized how fragile Maria's ego really was. The next morning, I found out Maria had unfollowed me on every platform. No messages, no final words, just a quiet attempt to erase me from her circle. I wasn't surprised. With Maria gone, the rest of the reunion was actually enjoyable. The tension had lifted, and for the first time in years, the gathering didn't feel like a competition. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter came naturally, and people started treating each other like family instead of rivals. It was ironic. Maria had always wanted to be the center of attention, the one everyone looked up to. But the moment she left, things got better for everyone. With Maria gone, the atmosphere at the reunion shifted entirely. Conversations were lighter, people were actually enjoying themselves, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a constant competition. A few relatives even joked about how much more peaceful everything was without her there. At one point, Maria's fiancé found me again, looking more frustrated than before. He admitted that her behavior over the past few months had been making him reconsider their future, and the reunion had only confirmed his doubts. He had always known she had an ego, but seeing how she dismissed and undermined others, even in front of family, made him realize how much of a problem it really was. By the time the reunion wrapped up, the gossip had spread. Word got around that after leaving, Maria had a full meltdown at our parents' house. She argued with our parents, furious that they didn't defend her more. Apparently, she felt betrayed that the family didn't rally behind her the way they used to. Despite everything, she never reached out. No apology, no attempt to smooth things over, just radio silence. If anything, it seemed like she doubled down on her bitterness. A week later, more news came in. Maria's fiancé officially ended the engagement. He cited her ego problem as the main reason, saying he couldn't be with someone who was more obsessed with her own image than the people around her. Then a relative who worked in the legal field mentioned that Maria had gotten into an argument at work. She had lashed out at a colleague and ended up getting written up by her firm. It wasn't a huge career-ending scandal, but it was another crack in the perfect image she had built for herself. Her reputation within the family crumbled fast. The same family members who once saw her as the golden child were now keeping their distance. Some of them even admitted they had always found her a little exhausting but never said anything before. My parents, on the other hand, were divided. They tried to protect Maria at first, claiming that I had set her up to look bad, but no one was buying it. The reality was too obvious. Maria had done it to herself. Eventually, even my parents had to admit the truth. My father, usually the quiet one, actually told me he was proud of how I handled everything. My mother took longer to come around, but finally acknowledged that Maria's behavior had been problematic for years. Meanwhile, Maria tried to salvage what she could. She unfollowed nearly every family member who had sided with me and suddenly started posting about humility and learning from mistakes. She even rebranded herself online, talking about personal growth and becoming a better person. No one bought it. While Maria's world was shrinking, mine was expanding. My company finalized a major partnership, and the deal was publicly announced, gaining a lot of attention in the industry. Some of the same relatives who once dismissed me were now reaching out, asking for business advice. A few weeks later, another family gathering was held. This time, Maria wasn't invited. No one even suggested including her. As I looked around at the people laughing, chatting, and actually enjoying themselves, it became clear. She had spent years trying to control how the family saw her. But in the end, the only thing she had really controlled was her own downfall. The best revenge wasn't proving anything to her. It was simply succeeding and moving forward. Maria's downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, messy, and completely self-inflicted. After being ignored by most of the family, she turned to social media, posting vague messages about fake people and how family is supposed to be supportive. The bitterness was obvious. She never mentioned me directly, but anyone who had been at the reunion knew exactly who she was talking about. At first, some relatives reacted to her posts, trying to be neutral, leaving a few supportive comments. But as she kept going, posting about how people change when money is involved and how real success isn't about wealth but character, even those started disappearing. She was making it clear she had no intention of letting this go, and people were getting tired of it. Family members who once admired her started quietly distancing themselves. My parents, seeing the writing on the wall, stopped defending her publicly. Even a few relatives who used to be close to her stopped liking her posts altogether. No one wanted to be involved in whatever this was turning into. Then, the professional fallout started. A relative who worked in the legal field mentioned that Maria had been butting heads with a few colleagues recently. Her confidence, once seen as an asset, had started rubbing people the wrong way, and there were murmurs that she needed to dial it back. It wasn't a good look. On top of that, she had been clashing with colleagues, pushing back against any feedback, acting like she was untouchable. The firm was now considering letting her go. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Maria tried reaching out to some family members, looking for sympathy. She called a few relatives, trying to spin the situation in her favor, making it seem like she was the real victim. But most of them had already moved on. Some ignored her completely. Others gave vague non-committal responses before changing the subject. She wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. Then she tried a different angle. She contacted our parents. She told them they needed to talk to me and convince me to stop making her look bad. She insisted that I had embarrassed her in front of the entire family and that I needed to fix things. Our parents didn't entertain it. My father told her bluntly that I hadn't done anything to her. She had done it to herself. My mother, finally seeing the truth, agreed. That was when I got an email. Maria sent me a message with a subject line that simply read, "We need to talk." The body of the email was a long rambling explanation of how things had gotten out of hand and how we should clear the air. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of anything she had done, just an attempt to reset things on her terms. I responded with one sentence, "Maria, your problems are not my responsibility." That was the last time she tried to contact me directly, but the hits kept coming for her. Word spread that her former fiancé had moved on. He had started dating someone else, and people who had seen them recently said he looked much happier. That news alone seemed to set Maria off because soon after, she started demanding he return the engagement ring. He refused. He told her that the ring was a gift, that it was his to keep. That only made her angrier, and she started ranting about how he had betrayed her. But by then, he wasn't listening. He had already blocked her on everything. My mother tried one last time to defend Maria. She started telling relatives that I had ruined Maria's life, that my success had made her look bad, that I had humiliated her in front of the family, but no one was buying it. Everyone had seen the way she had acted. There was nothing to defend. Then came a setback for Maria. One of her clients decided not to renew their contract. A relative mentioned that Maria's increasingly combative attitude at work had started raising concerns, and her firm was keeping a closer eye on her. Losing a client that important sent a clear message to her firm. It wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It was affecting business. Rumors started circulating that her boss was planning to fire her. At this point, even Maria seemed to realize things were falling apart. She made one last vague social media post about how some people only care about money. Unlike before, no one reacted. No likes, no comments, no engagement. No one cared anymore. The news spread quickly. Maria had been fired. A relative confirmed that her law firm had finally let her go after multiple warnings about her attitude and poor handling of clients. It wasn't a sudden decision. Her firm had been keeping an eye on her for months, and losing a major client had sealed her fate. Her downfall had been a slow self-inflicted disaster. With no job, Maria's online presence became even more erratic. Her once carefully curated social media, filled with posts about her high-powered career, transformed into vague messages about betrayal, starting over, and how loyalty means nothing anymore. Unlike before, where she would get engagement from family and acquaintances, her posts were now met with silence. Then came the most ridiculous part. My parents, who had spent years enabling her arrogance, started reaching out to me. They asked if I could help Maria get back on her feet. Maybe I had connections. Maybe I could find her something in a corporate setting. After all, family helps each other. Right? My response was simple. Not my problem. That was the last time the topic was brought up in my house. Meanwhile, Maria's ex-fiancé was moving on publicly and happily. A few days after Maria lost her job, he posted pictures from a vacation with his new girlfriend. The difference was obvious. He looked relaxed, carefree. There was no forced perfection, no need to maintain an image. He had completely detached from the mess Maria had created. Shortly after those posts, Maria disappeared from social media for a few days. No vague messages, no attempts to frame herself as the victim, just silence. But silence didn't mean change. Maria started reaching out to old friends, pretending as if nothing had happened. She sent messages as if she hadn't spent years looking down on them, ignoring them, acting as if she was above them. Some didn't bother responding. Others sent polite but brief replies before cutting the conversation short. She had burned too many bridges, and now that she needed those same people, they weren't interested. The next family gathering happened soon after. For the first time, Maria wasn't invited. No one even debated it. There was no discussion, no last-minute decision. She was simply left out. It was an unspoken agreement among everyone that things were better without her there. The gathering went smoothly. No passive-aggressive remarks. No unnecessary tension. Conversations were natural, relaxed. It was the kind of family event that hadn't existed in years. A few days later, a relative mentioned that Maria had applied for a job at a different law firm. It wasn't a prestigious one, not the kind she used to brag about. It was a lower-paying job, a step down from everything she had claimed to be, and she was rejected. Then the final attempt came. A long rambling message from Maria landed in my inbox. She blamed me for everything, losing her job, losing her fiancé, being cut off from the family. She accused me of turning people against her, of humiliating her on purpose. She painted herself as the victim, acting as if I had personally orchestrated her downfall. I didn't respond. I blocked her instead. That was the moment it became final. No more second chances. No more connections. Whatever relationship had existed before was gone. The relief among the family was noticeable. Some relatives admitted they had been waiting for this moment for years. Without Maria stirring up conflict, things felt easier, more natural. My mother, still struggling to accept reality, kept making excuses. She told people Maria was taking time to reflect, as if this was some sort of planned break. But no one believed her. They had seen too much. My father, on the other hand, saw the truth. At one of the last family events, someone quietly asked if Maria was okay. My father just sighed and said, "She did this to herself." After that, Maria started fading from view. Her once daily social media posts became rare. She stopped trying to reclaim her former image, realizing that no one was paying attention anymore. Meanwhile, my company hit another milestone, record profits, a new expansion, something that under normal circumstances would have driven Maria crazy if she knew, but none of it mattered anymore. With her out of my life, I kept moving forward, and I had no intention of looking back. Months passed, and just when it seemed like Maria had finally learned her lesson, she attempted a comeback. She started posting on social media again, acting as if nothing had happened. Gone were the bitter rants and vague complaints. Now, her posts were about growth and moving forward. She shared motivational quotes, talked about learning from failures, and even started posting about career tips, despite the fact that she had lost her once prestigious job, but no one cared. Her posts barely got any engagement. The family had completely moved on, where once her updates would be met with admiration and praise, now they were mostly ignored. A few distant acquaintances liked a couple of her posts out of politeness, but the people who truly knew her, her former inner circle, stayed silent. Maria's new reality was unavoidable. She no longer had the high-paying job, the admiration of her peers, or the fiancé she once flaunted. The prestige she had spent years carefully building had crumbled, and now she was left trying to piece together something from the wreckage. At the next family gathering, my parents showed up with mixed feelings. My father was relaxed, enjoying the drama-free atmosphere. My mother still seemed torn, but even she had to admit things were better now. When someone subtly brought up Maria's situation, my father just sighed and said, "She did this to herself." That was it. No defense, no sugarcoating, just the truth. Not long after, it was confirmed, Maria had taken a job at a much smaller law firm. The salary was a significant step down from what she used to brag about, and the position wasn't anywhere near as prestigious. A relative who still worked in the same industry mentioned that Maria had been humbled by how few options she had. She had spent years acting as if she was irreplaceable, and now she was learning the hard way that she wasn't. The family had moved past her entirely. Conversations no longer included her, not even in passing. When her name did come up, it was in a vague dismissive way, like an afterthought, not someone worth discussing. Then her last desperate move. Even though I had already blocked her, she tried interacting with my social media in other ways. She started liking comments from mutual acquaintances, responding to posts made by relatives who still spoke to me, almost as if she was trying to get my attention indirectly. It didn't work. Frustrated, she made one last bitter post. A long-winded message about how people only support you when you are at the top, and how some family members are only happy when you fail. Instead of sympathy, it completely backfired. The comments section wasn't filled with concern. It was filled with mockery. People called her out, reminding her of how she had treated others. Some left laughing emojis. A few relatives, who had kept quiet until now, openly told her that she had no one to blame but herself. Realizing she was only embarrassing herself, Maria deleted everything. Her entire attempt at reclaiming her image vanished overnight. Then, her final attempt at contact. She asked a relative to pass a message to me saying that we needed to talk. The relative didn't even hesitate before responding. Dude, he does not care about you anymore. Move on. That was the last anyone heard of Maria trying to reconnect. She finally faded into obscurity, no longer trying to force herself back into the family dynamic. No more desperate posts, no more bitter messages, just silence. Meanwhile, I focused on the people who actually mattered. I hosted a dinner with the relatives who had been supportive throughout everything, a real gathering with no competition, no passive-aggressive remarks, no pressure to prove anything, just genuine conversation and laughter. Maria had spent years trying to control how the family saw her. She had built her life around status, around making sure she was always at the top. But in the end, none of it mattered. Now, she was nothing more than a bad memory, and I was thriving, surrounded by people who actually cared.